Hello and welcome back to another video and the final video of my European road trip series. I'm now at home in sunny Manchester, here sat in my conservatory enjoying a nice cup of tea. It's a bit too hot yet. Glorious weather we're having at the moment. It feels like summer is actually here. So, the road trip I recently went on was 3 weeks long and started on the 7th of June. I drove from Manchester down to London, where I stayed overnight with a friend, and set off early morning on the 8th, where I drove to Dover and took a ferry across to Calais. I'd booked a flexible reservation, so I was actually booked on the 9:45 ferry but was able to take the 8:15, so that all worked out really well, because it got me into France a bit earlier that day and able to reach the overnight stop a little sooner. So I drove from Calais across into Belgium, where I had a lunch stop and topped up with just a little bit of diesel because the motorway prices were a little higher than elsewhere. So I bought enough just to get me to the overnight stop and had a spot of lunch, and then carried on into the Netherlands, which was probably my shortest trip in the Netherlands. Was there for about 15 minutes before crossing the border into Germany. So the first day of leaving the UK, I drove in the UK, France, Belgium, Netherlands and Germany. 5 countries in one day. It's pretty cool. The only place my passport was checked on this day was in Dover. As the French immigration are based in Dover for those crossings, and you go through immigration before leaving the UK, which I really like, because when you arrive in Calais, you just exit the ferry and just drive. There's no waiting or faffing about. So the first overnight stop in Europe was in the city of Wuppertal, which I've been to once before. It's famous for its Schwebebahn, which is a train that dangles beneath the track rather than running on top of it. Most of it runs above the river Wupper, and a little section runs above the road, which is really strange to drive underneath when a train is passing over you. So in Wuppertal we stayed at the B&B hotels. This is not a bed and breakfast as such, but there's a chain of hotels in Europe and maybe further afield called B&B hotels. So the cost of the hotel was very reasonable at £46.11. I'd actually booked it through booking.com. When I arrived at the hotel, the hotel was unmanned at the time, which I think was about 3 p.m. But there was a machine outside the front door where you could check in yourself. It found my reservation, asked me for my credit card to confirm the reservation, and then promptly charged me for the room, even though I'd already paid it. I did get a refund, but it took a couple of weeks after this. So overnight in Wuppertal, and the next day continued on to Berlin, where I stayed with friends for a week. Whilst in Berlin, I did a side trip to the city of Stettin in Poland, which is a really, really nice city. I had a look around the Transport Museum and a mooch around the city centre, including like an old town with beautiful cobble squares, a really delightful city to visit. Drove back from Stettin to Berlin that evening and encountered the only border formalities I encountered during this whole trip, with the exception of leaving and entering the UK. On entering Germany from Poland, there were cones across the motorway and you were funneled off into an area that's been used in the past before Schengen existed for border checks. The police wanted to check my passport, my driving license, and documents for the vehicle that I was driving. It took a little while, but they released us in a few minutes, and we carried on with the journey. So the next stop after Berlin was the small town, or even village, of Probstzella, which is really, really small, but was famous when Germany was divided for having border formalities in its train station, being on the main line between Berlin and Munich. I stayed overnight in a really unusual hotel called Bauhaus des Volks, which is a Bauhaus design hotel from the 1920s. The hotel has gone through various stages in its history, including its original design, which was frequented by the Nazi Party in the 1930s, to falling into some disrepair during the post-reunification period, and then more recently, in the last 10 to 15 years, being renovated to its current state. It does feel a really strange place, if I'm honest. Something like a cross between a hostel and a mental institution, but nevertheless, it was a comfortable night there. The next day, the plan was to drive to Liechtenstein, which I did, heading south through Germany, entered Austria for a little while, and then crossed the border into Liechtenstein. There appears to be a hard border between Austria and Liechtenstein, but there's a few police hanging around, but I just drove straight through, so no formalities as such there. I didn't have a hotel booked for Liechtenstein, so I tried to find one when I arrived, and the cheapest hotel for that night was over £400. So I backtracked about 7 miles, 15 minutes drive, back over the border into Austria, and stayed in the nearby town of Feldkirch, where a hotel could be had for £84. Still enough for my road trip budget, but a lot more acceptable than the prices in Liechtenstein. So the next day I drove back into Liechtenstein, parked up, had a mooch around, so I could really explore the city, the capital city of Vaduz, which is absolutely gorgeous. that day the plan was to drive on to Turin in Italy, which I did, driving straight across the Swiss Alps. The roads across the Swiss Alps are absolutely like God's racetrack. They're fantastic. The views are breathtaking for hours and hours on end. It was probably the most enjoyable drive of my entire life. Once arriving into Italy, boy can you tell a difference. Because the roads are all crumbling and the driving standards decreased dramatically. It doesn't matter in Italy whether you're driving at 30 kilometers an hour or 130 kilometers an hour. There will be someone in a rusty old Fiat 2 centimeters away from your back bumper. So I didn't really enjoy driving in Italy. Anyway, I made it to my overnight stop in Turin, and the hotel cost me just under £41, so that was one of my cheaper overnight stops. But boy did it feel sketchy. I did not like Turin at all. The area where I was staying, which is very close to the centre, all the buildings were full of graffiti, and there were large groups of men hanging around on most street corners, and it just felt unwelcoming, slightly intimidating, and not a nice place. I wouldn't choose to go back to Turin unless I really had to. From Turin, I drove southwards to the Mediterranean coast. Another nice drive, but not quite as picturesque as driving over the Swiss Alps. I headed south and met the Mediterranean at the town of Imperia in Italy, where I stopped for a lunch break. And from there, I continued westwards along the Mediterranean coast to my next overnight stop in Menton in France, which is within walking distance of the Italian border, but just inside France. So I stayed overnight in Menton, and whilst I was there, I caught the train into Monte Carlo in the country of Monaco, the very small country of Monaco. That enabled me to have a look round and explore the place, including the crowds that gather outside the very famous casino with all the expensive cars parked outside. So my overnight stay in Menton cost me £78.62, so nearly twice what my overnight stay in Turin cost, but it felt like a much nicer place. The next day, I headed from Menton to Toulon, which is further west along the southern coast of France. I booked a hotel from the Accor group called the Formula One Hotel in Toulon, which cost me just over £50. I didn't realise at the time of booking, but the Formula One hotels, the bedrooms don't have a private bathroom. They have a sink, so you can have a wash, brush your teeth, whatever, but if you want the toilet or you want to have a shower, there's very clean facilities, but they're shared. The hotel was also in the middle of an industrial estate, and there were some kind of strange looking caravans parked along the road, which I'm not even sure if were being lived in or abandoned, because they looked quite rough. But the hotel was within walking distance of IKEA. So I walked over to IKEA for my evening meal. The main restaurant had closed, but the little cafe that they have near the checkouts was open, so I got 2 hot dogs, 1 pork and 1 fish. And they were very nice. So that kept me going for that evening. From Menton, I had a longer drive the next day. I made it all the way to my next country of Andorra. In Andorra, I stayed overnight at the Hotel des Pyrénées, and that cost me £80 with an additional charge to park my car in the car park, which I didn't really have an option about because it was right in the city centre. What a beautiful place. I really enjoyed my overnight stop in Andorra. Lots of bars and restaurants, great food. I really enjoyed my overnight there. It seems to be a place that's set up for lots of duty-free shopping. Every other shop seems to be selling cigarettes, alcohol, or both, which I didn't buy any, but I did fill my car up with diesel at the cheapest price on the entire trip. It worked out at £1.05 per litre. And I'll go through some more details about fuel costs later in the video. From Andorra, I drove south into Spain and headed west to the city of Palencia, where my plan was to cross paths with a friend of mine, and we met up and spent a couple of days catching up, which was really nice. When he said he was in Palencia, I thought he said Valencia at first, but no, Palencia with a P. I'd never heard of such a place. It's, if you look on a map, it's about halfway between Santander on the northern coast and Madrid, which is right in the middle. But it was a really nice place. A city, but a small city, and nice to explore. And I felt like I was probably the only British tourist there. A very Spanish city, but nice to visit. I spent 3 nights there in total in 2 different hotels. I arrived without any reservation, and the hotel I intended staying at for the first night could accommodate me for the first night, but they were fully booked for the subsequent 2. So my first night cost me £63, and then I booked a different hotel for nights 2 and 3 in Palencia, which cost me £140. The first hotel included breakfast, the second hotel didn't. I'm not really bothered if I get breakfast included in hotels because it's usually rubbish. I'd rather just buy a croissant from a bakery and make a coffee in the bedroom if there's facilities to do so. So after my time in Palencia, I started to head roughly homewards. I drove up to San Sebastian on the northeast coast of Spain, which was a really pretty place to have a look round and stop for lunch. And from there I drove north back into France, and just north of Biarritz there's a city called Dax, D-A-X. I'd never heard of it before, but it just seemed a comfortable distance for an overnight stop, and I stayed in a Campanile hotel there for £58. That was nothing really in the area to interest me or to do, so early the next day I set off to my next stop, which was in the city of Angers. I stayed 2 nights in Angers, and the fun fact is that it's twinned with Wigan, of all places. So I had a look on TripAdvisor what to do whilst I was in Angers, and the recommended top tourist thing to do was to go on a tour of the Cointreau distillery, which I did, and I thoroughly enjoyed. It was fascinating to learn how Cointreau is made and the history of the company, and how every single drop of Cointreau that you might drink anywhere in the world is made in that one place. So of course I had to buy a souvenir bottle to bring home. My 2 nights in Angers cost me £130. This is only at a budget hotel, it was an Ibis budget, which is enough to pay for such a basic hotel, but it was comfortable. The staff were friendly, and it was right next to a McDonald's, which is where I ended up eating. Double filet-o fish available in France, absolutely delightful. One more overnight stop in the city of Saint-Malo on the northern coast, where I stayed in one of those Formula One hotels without the private bathroom again. But it was very, very convenient for the Channel port, as my ferry home, or back to the UK, was an 8 AM departure, so I didn't want a long drive before that. The ferry was actually a catamaran operated by Condor, but also Brittany Ferries seems to be having a bit of an identity crisis, whether it's Condor or Brittany Ferries. There are both named throughout the vessel and the port. The travel time from St Malo to Poole in Dorset on the south coast of England was 6 hours. That consisted of 2 hours from St Malo to Guernsey, 1 hour in Guernsey, then 3 hours from Guernsey to Poole. The convenient part of it was that you exit the ship in Guernsey into the terminal and go through UK immigration, and then back on the boat, or ship, or catamaran. So that made it super convenient on arriving in Poole, where you could just exit the ship and drive. There were some officials standing around. I think they were doing random checks on occasional vehicles, but I just drove through. So all my hotels for the entire trip came to £876.34, but also bear in mind that I spent 7 nights staying with friends, 1 night in London and 6 nights in Berlin. So if you were doing a similar trip, there could be extra costs involved for those overnight stays. So coming to the car and the cost of fuel. So from leaving home to a few days after arriving back, when I next filled up, I'd completed 4,380 miles. Maybe about 100 miles of that was done after getting home, before I next filled up. The average miles per gallon of my Audi Q2 turbo diesel was 56.09, which I'm really happy with. I don't think any petrol or electric car would be able to compete with that. Bear in mind the cost of all the fuel was £442. The most expensive fuel that I bought was, I think in France, £1.59 a litre in euros, so that works out at 138. The cheaper fuels I managed to fill up were, as previously mentioned, in Andorra it was £1.05 per litre. In Poland it was £1.12 per litre. In Spain it was £1.18 per litre, and in Germany, in Wuppertal, it was £1.25 a litre. So almost all of those cheaper than the UK. France works out about the same, maybe a couple of pence more. What was interesting was that in all the countries, diesel was cheaper than petrol, unlike the UK, where diesel somehow is seen as the bad guy these days, despite the fact I have a modern diesel car that uses AdBlue and the emissions are very, very clean. So the total cost for the entire 3-week journey, hotels and fuel, is £1,319. I don't think that's too bad for a 3-week trip that includes 13 different countries. Well, UK plus 12 other countries, including 3 countries that I'd never visited before, which are the very tiny countries of Liechtenstein, Monaco and Andorra. I could have happily stayed in Spain longer, maybe driven into Portugal, but I had some commitments at home, so that's why I headed back when I did. I thoroughly enjoyed the trip, despite some driving for about 5-6 hours a few days. I didn't cover any massive distances. I think my longest drive was from Andorra to Palencia, which was about 400 miles, but that was on very, very good Spanish motorways, which were not even toll roads. They were free of charge, and I was able to cover good distances. Every country I drove in, I'd say with the possible exception of Italy, was enjoyable to drive in, much more enjoyable than the UK. Roads less congested and much more free-flowing traffic. Even when there's roadworks on a motorway or something, it just seems not overly congested. I didn't pay for any toll roads. I chose to drive without tolls on my sat-nav. I was considering paying for toll roads, but you can compare on the Apple Maps how long for the non-toll and how long for the toll roads, and usually there wasn't much difference. And if you select the non-toll roads, half of it's motorways anyway. It's just a free motorway instead of a paid motorway. So I didn't pay any road tolls, with the one exception, which was to cross the Millau Viaduct, and that was about £11. That's actually a free motorway, but the toll is for the bridge. Would I do the trip again? Absolutely, 100% yes, and maybe I will later this year. If you find this information interesting, please comment below. Would you do a similar journey? How many countries can you drive in one trip? It might be interesting to do some more eastern countries in Europe. Where would you suggest? If you found this information useful, or even if you didn't, if you're still with me now, please give the video a like, comment down below, subscribe to the channel if you're interested in more similar content coming up, and I will see you soon. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.